Hello my treasures, it's time for the release of Audiopocalypse, the mini set for Festival of Legends, and because of this we're going to do what I usually do, which is coming up with 11 wacky deck ideas for you to try out on day 1. So this video will probably be released before I actually get up for the day, and because of which I can't actually give you deck strings for any of these lists. However, I will be leaving Hearthstone deck build links down below, which will allow you to see all the cards anyways. The first list that we're going to be looking at is a Mill Death Knight. Mill Death Knight is going to be centered around the new card Yelling Yodeler with Selfish Shellfish and a bunch of the previous Death Rattle support that we saw in the Festival of Legends set. So honestly, meta-wise, it would probably be a better idea to do a very similar idea with either Cagehead or Naval Mine as a way to OTK your opponent that way. But we're here for the wackiness factor, and that's why I ended up settling on this. The idea is basically to use that Death Rattle support to copy the Death Rattle of Shellfish as many times as humanly possible, while also spreading it using cards like Death Growl, which in theory should be able to mill your opponent before you run out of cards yourself. And if you can't win through that, then you're probably going to just win through attrition with a bunch of really cheap minions. Now let's get onto the Demon Hunter list I came up with, which is Menagerie Rush Demon Hunter. The goal behind this deck is to show off the new legendary Rhyme Dancer Rissa as a way to buff up all of our minions through Dark Raven. That gives all of our minions +1 attack whenever a friend rush minion does attack. We're also going to try to showcase Magatha Bane of Music as a draw engine within the deck and a deck building restriction, which means we do not run that many spells in the deck. Multi-Strike and Illidari Studies are the only two. We do have a few ways to get additional spells, which are Nerubian Visor or School Teacher, which should minimize the chances of us actually giving any spells to our opponent. This deck is definitely going to be for those aggro fans that want something a little bit wacky. Alright, let's get into the Druid deck. This one will spell the Doom to our opponent with Doomkin as a way to prevent our opponent from ever advancing in the game. Now, you might be asking, there aren't really that many ways to get additional copies of this. How are we going to prevent our opponent from ever getting any more mana? Well, we have things like Zola and Fizzle in order to loop the card, and we also are going to be using Elite Tauren Champion as a way to do some damage to our opponent's face, while also having the incredibly wacky Youthful Brewmaster as a way to bounce him back if we really need to. Overall, this deck is going to be using the Hero Power package to survive until late game, where you can just keep wailing on your opponent's face with big attacks from your hero each individual turn. Alright, I've been wanting to do a secret deck for quite a long time, so let's look at Hunter. Hunter, we are going to be playing Infuse Secret Hunter, where we're going to try to rely on the fact that a lot of Hunter secrets summon random minions, which we can then use to infuse some of the very powerful infuses that exist in the games. And while Hunter might be the weakest class currently for secrets in Standard Hearthstone, we're really hoping that the secrets that do exist in Standard for Hunter will create a backbone for a more control style of Hunter deck, so we can finish off our opponents with the big infused targets as mentioned before. Now, let's get into a really wacky deck, and probably the wackiest deck out of the entire bunch. Thaddeus Mage, or what I like to call it, Thaddeus Champion, where we're trying to get as many copies as Elite Tauren Champion as humanly possible. And you might be thinking, how are you going to get as many copies of these to actually give you the finale? Well, the other half of this deck's namesake is Thaddeus. But wait, Thaddeus is a 10 cost card, so how are we going to get enough mana to play down Elite Tauren Champion? Well, Remixed Dispensobot actually can give us some coins, thus allowing us to put down multiple copies real easily and trigger the finale on multiple copies, as each copy will only cost 1, and we can always just use an additional coin to slam down a second or third. Alright, let's get on to the next deck, which is going to be Paladin. This is probably the one I'm most excited for. The idea for this one is Weapon Paladin. Yes, you heard me right. Horn of the Wind Lord allows us to attack twice per turn, and thus hit our opponent for a huge amount of damage if we do buff up our hero. To do this, we have both Feast and Famine and for Quell the Loss. This will allow, without getting some additional copy through other means, up to 24 points of damage However, if we do find a additional copy of any of these cards before we do pull this combo off, we can easily get up to 30 damage to just finish off our opponent that way. We also are going to be using a lot of undead in this deck in order to make full advantage off of Nerubian Visor, while also using a lot of those undead minions to put board pressure on the board so we can actually finish off our opponent pretty easily with a huge weapon swing. And this style of deck is something that I've been wanting to do for so long. However, no classes in standard Hearthstone ever felt like we could pull off something this big. Now let's get on to the next list, which is going to be Overkill with Overheal Priest. This is going to be a aggro style of deck. We're going to be using the new cards of Funnel Cake and Ambient Light Spawn in order to buff up this deck even further than where it existed before. Generally, this deck is going to be trying to swarm the board with a lot of really cheap minions that get a lot of advantage off of overhealing them. And then if that doesn't work out, we're going to be trying to get additional copies of Heartbreaker in order to OTK our opponent that way. I really don't expect that win condition to ever really come up when playing this deck, and most of the time you're probably going to just win through the overheal advantage that you're going to get off of basically every minion in deck. All right, let's get into Rogue. And for this, we're going to be playing Secret Rogue, but with a little bit of a twist. We're going to be using Elite Torn Champion in order to try to fix the problem that Secret Rogue currently has, where it doesn't really have that big of a win condition. Now, with cards like Shadow Step or even a Breakdance, we can bounce back our Elite Tauren Champion as many times as humanly possible to fill our opponent's hand with a bunch of picks. And these picks will all explode for 8 damage if our opponent can't spend all of their mana. And to prevent our opponent from spending all of their mana, we are also going to be using things like Ghastly Gravedigger as a way to put cards back into the deck we don't want them to have, and to try to force our opponent to actually explode those picks. Hopefully, Elite Tauren Champion will prove to be the win condition that I think it will be for this style of deck, and maybe push this into the meta. So let's get into Shaman, which is going to be Totem Shaman, except with Magatha, Bane of Music. Totem Shaman already didn't use too many spells, and the spells that they did use consistently were spells that we don't really care too much about our opponent getting access to. This being Totemic Evidence as the only spell within the entire deck. And while normally I would be worried about using a Magatha in a deck where we don't have a lot of additional draw power outside of her, we do have Ravengers in order to draw through our mistakes, our amalgams, and clownfishes within it. Overall, this is probably not the most wacky deck that I have in this entire batch, but it should be a great deck to showcase the mighty strength of Magatha, Bane of Music. But let's turn the wackiness up to 11 with Phantom, Lord of the Opera. If you saw this card, you knew this deck was coming. There was no way I was going to make a Warlock list without showcasing this card in particular. I know he isn't the best card in the world, but he's incredibly funny. So I saw potential and I went with it. At the core, this list is a Thaddeus Warlock deck. We are also going to be relying on the Jailer in order to empty out our deck so we can get free phantoms as soon as possible, though we do have a little bit of an extra spicy twist where we're going to be using Fizzle and Zola in order to get additional copies in case our opponent destroys Phantom with some type of AoE board clear, which we all know is going to happen. They're going to eventually run out of board clears, and we're not going to run out of 15/15s, and that's how we're going to try to win the game. It's also worth mentioning we are using a small imp package as an additional draw engine. This should, in theory, allow us to get out Phantom quicker than we would if we just waited until we slammed down the Jailer and actually have him as a alternate win condition instead of a win more card using the Jailer win con. So let's get on to the final deck, aka Abyss Taunt Warrior. So when I first saw Abyssal Basis revealed for both Warrior and Demon Hunter, I was excited because it was one of the first dual class cards revealed, but for another reason. There are only 3 cards that, if you target it with an Amalgam of the Deep, that it can generate, which includes a copy of itself. It also can be used to guarantee 1 Amalgam ban, which is actually pretty good in this list too. The goal behind this deck is to get as many copies of this basis as humanly possible. We have Amalgam of the Deep, as mentioned before, Brighton Flunky, and Remix Tuning Fork, all of which can generate random taunt minions. It's going to be a real fun one to test out. It's going to be incredibly annoying. It takes a lot of inspiration from the Brute Demon Hunter decks from last year or the year before that card got nerfed. Now, if you happen to playtest any of these decks, let me know how well they turned out down below, and if you made any changes to the list. I'm probably going to start out with the Paladin list because that is just a deck that's straight up my alley, and I can't wait to try something out that hasn't existed, I think, in the history of Hearthstone, at least in Paladin. And like always, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, bye bye.